Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're now going to talk about the second portion of the tax cases, being the technical portion, and go through a few cases, probably about 6 together, but maybe refer to other cases as we're going through. So the first we're going to start with is a company called Joel Theatrical. And what I'm going to do at first is look at something called a key criteria view. Now, the key criteria view will look at different components of a project. And hopefully help us to identify what the shortcomings would be. So the various steps would be, do we have objectives and results? Have the results compared to the objectives? Have we done benchmarks or prior art searches to figure out what the state of the technology is? And therefore, are we thinking outside the box? This is usually then illustrated by determining what the variables of uncertainty are, or the areas that we're going to research that go beyond standard practice. So in every industry or business, you'll have research that's defined by some variables. You can call them W, X, Y, or Z, or whatever the case may be, that a research team says, here's what we know, here's what we don't know in order to achieve those objectives. And as a team, here's the factors or things or variables that we think we should experiment with in relation to other variables in order to make this happen. And the variables will change by industry to industry, but the structure will remain consistent. So what we're looking for in an SR&ED project is for the researcher to define variables that exceed the methods available or readily available to someone skilled in the art within standard practice. So in this case, the client talked about bolts to engage different drums when they moved, methods to remove chains and sprockets, and methods to remove sprockets from limit switches. Okay? If we look at the actual case itself, and I realize it's relatively small, but what we'll try to do is look through what was actually provided. So we're told that this case looked at claims for 2008 and 2009, and that the client had to develop something, a fire curtain, for a project at Ryerson University. Now, what's interesting about this is we're not given a lot of details as to what the specific goals or performance objectives were, but we can work backwards from this. That they wanted to eliminate counterweights, that they wanted a maximum speed at how fast the curtain could fall, and they had cost constraints. So we're told all of these things within the case, and we can use that therefore to work backwards and create hopefully a project description, or a project description lacking something, so we can determine what was the missing component that led to ineligibility or provided the basis for eligibility. Okay, so we're told that in this case, we only had a few witnesses at the trial. There was a Mr. Marino, who was the vice president and owner, and his accountant. Okay, we're told that Mr. Marino is knowledgeable about theatrical rigging with 36 years of experience. However, one of the big issues in this case that the judge focused on is that he didn't have a formal education in any field of science or engineering, and he didn't hire a professional engineer to help with any of the issues. Now, what was interesting is that the client in this case did produce 4 patents and talked about how there were similar technologies or similar technologies at the time. However, under cross-examination, the client himself couldn't provide answers on the spot as required by the judge, including things like, what were the search terms or things along that nature. Okay? So in response, we went forward and said, okay, well, let's look at what the description was of the hypothesis, and then what the corresponding issues were with the CRA in perhaps denying the claim and the tax court in supporting this position. They're saying that their original hypothesis was to minimize the modifications when enabling the function of the curtain wall. Their first attempt involved removing the chain from the sprocket, which controls the cable drum, as a limit switch controlled is controlled within the cable drum. It says this document then describes an unsuccessful outcome. And this is really the part that I'm saying, well, that's the core SR&ED there, really. Why was it unsuccessful? What choices did we make that were unsuccessful? What did we learn from it being unsuccessful? Why we would never do it again? And in fact, could that understanding of the variables that caused that success or lack of success, again, be an indicator of something that we could use to define a project or not? We say next we predicted that removing the entire sprocket from the limit switch would be more effective. Document describes another outcome. A third series of experiments would remove the entire cable drum, creating a closed loop cording system. Document then describes another outcome. So again, what's happened in the court is I would, as a scientist or someone who's looking as an engineer, would like to understand a little more of the details about those other outcomes. What was different about those outcomes? Why did we think that would work? How did it compare to expectations? What did we learn from it at the end of the day? And that seems to be removed from the court reporting itself. So perhaps relevant information to an engineer or scientist, I'm not sure why it's not being seen as such within the court reporting, and therefore whether the court reporting is providing all the information that could be relevant to stakeholders. The challenge from the CRA was that it really maybe was not within the realm of science because the performer was not qualified. They basically said in the court, in summary, Mr. Marino and his colleagues began the work on how to control the descent of the fire curtain without the counterweights. However, I have not been persuaded there was no technology that may have been available had they found or worked with a consulting professional engineer. So we'll see this as one of the issues that I see popping up over and over again is new challenges to the qualifications of the researcher.